There is a fine line between peace and chaos, and we love to explore that tension in every video. Watch as the pressure builds and the truth finally explodes in a burst of cinematic energy. Hit subscribe now and witness the breaking point for yourself.
No. The fluorescent light above my cot flickered twice every night at exactly 11 o'clock. I know because I counted. For 412 days, I counted everything. The flickers, the footsteps of the guards, the meals pushed through the slot of my door, the number of times my son came to visit me and I told them to send him away. 41 times. He came 41 times. He came 41 times. I turned him away every single one. My name is Gerald. I am 67 years old. I built a regional logistics company from a single pickup truck and a handshake agreement with a hardware store in Tulsa. By the time my hair turned gray, that company had contracts in 11 states and employed over 200 people. I was not a perfect man, but I was an honest one, and I never, in 67 years of living, imagined that the person who would take everything from me would be the boy I taught to ride a bike in our driveway on a Saturday morning in 1987. I want to tell you what happened, not because I need sympathy. I am past the age of needing sympathy. I am past the age of needing sympathy. I want to tell you, because the ending is something I spent 412 days planning inside a 6x9 cell, and I want you to understand that patience is not weakness. Patience, when it is cold and deliberate and aimed at the truth, is the most powerful thing a man can possess. My son's name is Nathan. He is 38 years old. He has his mother's eyes, which is something I used to consider a blessing. His wife's name is Courtney. She came into our lives 6 years ago at a company holiday party, wearing a red dress and a smile that I now recognize as the kind that calculates while it charms. I did not dislike her immediately. That is important to understand. I wanted to like her. Nathan was happy, and I wanted my son to be happy. My wife passed 8 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 91 days from diagnosis to burial. After she was gone, it was just Nathan and me, and then Nathan and Courtney and me, and I told myself that was enough. A man adjusts. A man finds new rhythms. The trouble started the way most trouble does, quietly, and then all at once. 2 years before my arrest, I had a minor cardiac episode. Nothing catastrophic. I spent 3 days in Mercy General, had a stent placed, was told to reduce stress and increase fiber. Nathan drove me home from the hospital, and during that 40-minute drive, he said something I did not think much about at the time. He said, "Dad, you should really think about getting your affairs in order, just in case." I told him I appreciated the concern. I assumed it was worry, a son worried about its father's health. That is a natural thing. 3 weeks later, Nathan and Courtney came to dinner at my house. Courtney had brought a bottle of wine and a folder. The folder, she explained over dessert, contained a durable power of attorney document. Standard, she said. Protective, she said. Just a formality so that if something happened to me, Nathan could handle things smoothly without going through probate complications. She was very calm when she explained it. Very warm. She touched my hand twice. I told them I would have my attorney, a man named Douglas, who had handled my business affairs for 20 years, review it before I signed anything. Courtney smiled and said, "Of course." Nathan said, "Of course." We finished the pie. I called Douglas the next morning. He reviewed the document that afternoon and called me back before 5 o'clock. He said, "Gerald, do not sign this. This is not a standard power of attorney. This grants Nathan full control over your personal assets, your business, and your medical decisions, with almost no limitations and no sunset clause. This is written by someone who knows exactly what they're doing." I thanked Douglas. I did not sign. When I told Nathan, his voice changed in a way I had not heard before. Not angry exactly. Tight. Like a door being closed very carefully to avoid making noise. He said Douglas was being overly cautious. He said it was insulting that I didn't trust my own son. He said Courtney had only been trying to help. He said these things in a calm, measured tone that I now understand was practiced. I should have known then. I did not know then. 6 months later, I was arrested. The charge was elder financial abuse. Specifically, the alleged theft of $240,000 from a joint account I shared with my late wife's sister, a woman named Patricia who had dementia and lived in a memory care facility in Broken Arrow. I had not touched that account in 4 years. I did not have access to that account. I had been removed as a signatory when Patricia's condition worsened at the family's request, which I had agreed to without argument because it was the right thing to do. None of that mattered on the morning 2 officers from the Tulsa County Sheriff's Department knocked on my door at 6:45 in the morning. Nathan and Courtney were standing in my driveway when the patrol car pulled up. I remember that clearly. They were standing there before the officers arrived. Courtney had her arms crossed. Nathan was looking at his phone. Neither of them looked surprised. I was wearing my robe. I had not yet had coffee. I was 65 years old, standing in my own driveway in my robe, being handcuffed in front of my neighbor's sprinkler system that was running on its morning cycle. That image has stayed with me. The sprinkler just kept going. Tick, tick, tick. Like nothing unusual was happening at all. I will not detail every procedural humiliation that followed because that is not the point. The point is that within 72 hours of my arrest, Nathan had filed an emergency petition with the county court to assume temporary control of my business assets, citing my arrest and my prior cardiac episode as evidence that I was no longer capable of managing company affairs. The petition was granted pending investigation. My attorney, not Douglas, because Nathan had somehow gotten Douglas to recuse himself from my case, citing a conflict of interest I still do not fully understand, was a court-appointed public defender named James who was 26 years old and handling 11 other cases. James was not incompetent. James was simply overwhelmed, and I was not his most urgent problem. I spent 14 months in county detention, and then another 10 months in a minimum security facility outside of Claremore while the case moved through the system. The alleged theft was real. $240,000 had been moved from Patricia's account. It had not been moved by me. Proving that required tracing financial records that someone had gone to considerable effort to obscure. During those 412 days, Nathan visited 41 times. He always came alone. He always said the same things. That he was sorry this was happening. That he was doing his best to hold things together. That the company needed stable leadership. That he missed me. That he hoped I would come home soon. He said these things through the visitation glass with his mother's eyes, and every time I asked the guard to take me back to my cell. I was not being dramatic. I was not being cruel. I was protecting information. Because here's what Nathan did not know. 6 weeks before my arrest, I had lunch with a man named Roy Chen. Roy was a forensic accountant who had done work for Douglas in the past, and Douglas had quietly recommended him to me after the power of attorney incident. I had hired Roy to do a general audit of my business accounts, not because I suspected anything specific, but because I am the kind of man who checks. Roy had been working for 3 weeks when I was arrested. His work stopped. But Roy had already found something. Courtney had a background before Nathan that she had not disclosed. A civil judgment in Colorado for fraud, a former business partner who had obtained a restraining order, a pattern that, to a forensic accountant who had seen similar patterns before, suggested a specific kind of long game. Roy kept working after my arrest. He did not stop. He told me later that he continued because Douglas asked him to, and Douglas continued because he had felt guilty about the recusal. And guilt, it turns out, is a useful fuel. Roy worked without pay for 8 months. I did not know this until later. There are still people in this world who act out of principle, and I want to say that plainly. So it is not lost in the rest of what I am about to tell you. While I was in my cell counting flickering lights and turned away visits, the following things were happening on the outside. Nathan had used his temporary business control to restructure my company's primary contracts, steering 2 major distribution accounts to a new logistics firm that had been incorporated in Delaware 4 months before my arrest. That Delaware company had one beneficial owner. The name on the incorporation documents was not Nathan's name. It was Courtney's maiden name. My company was not being stolen loudly. It was being drained. The way you drain a bathtub, slowly from the bottom, while you keep the water running at the top so no one notices the level dropping. Roy found this. Roy documented it. Roy brought it to Douglas. Douglas brought it to a private attorney named Helen Park, who specialized in financial fraud and elder abuse cases, and who had, as it happened, a personal reason to take on cases involving the exploitation of elderly individuals that she does not discuss publicly, but that motivated her considerably. Helen filed a motion to reopen the evidentiary record in my case 14 months into my detention. It took another 4 months to work through, but it worked. The morning I was released, I did not look like a man who had spent 412 days in a cell. I had made sure of that. I had exercised every day. I had read every book the facility library carried, some of them twice. I had slept 8 hours a night with the discipline of a man who understood that his mind was the only asset he still fully controlled, and he was not going to let it deteriorate. I put on the clothes my neighbor Mrs. Calloway had dropped off the week before. A gray suit, a white shirt, my wife's favorite tie, which she had bought me for our 30th anniversary. It was a little loose. I had lost some weight, but I stood in the processing area of that facility and I looked like what I was, a man who had been waiting and was now done waiting. Helen was outside with Roy. Douglas was there too, standing slightly behind them, which was appropriate. My neighbor Mrs. Calloway had come, which I had not expected and which affected me more than I will fully describe. Nathan and Courtney were not there. I had not expected them to be. They did not know what was coming. They knew I was being released. The exoneration had been filed and my case dismissed, with a public finding that the financial records used to charge me had been fabricated. But they did not know about the parallel track that Helen had been building for 14 months while I sat in my cell. The parallel track was this: a civil suit for financial fraud, elder financial abuse, business asset misappropriation, and breach of fiduciary duty, totaling approximately $4.2 million in claimed damages, filed jointly against Nathan and Courtney in Tulsa County District Court, filed the same morning of my release. Same hour. There was also a referral to the Oklahoma Securities Commission regarding the Delaware company and the redirected contracts, and a referral to the district attorney's office. Helen had been thorough. Helen believed in building structures that do not collapse under pressure. I did not go home that morning. I went to the offices of my company, which was called Archer Logistics, because my father's middle name was Archer, and I had wanted to carry something of him into everything I built. The offices were in a 2-story building on the east side of Tulsa that I had owned outright since 2009. The parking lot had my name on a reserved space near the door, though someone had placed an orange cone in it. I moved the cone. Inside, the receptionist, a young woman named Brianna, who had worked there for 2 years and who I later learned had been quietly documenting irregularities in the company's billing records because she did not think what was happening was right, looked up when I walked in. Her face went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, something that I think was relief. I asked her if Nathan was in. She said he was upstairs in a meeting. I told her not to call ahead. I took the stairs. Nathan was in my office. He had moved my desk. He had taken down the framed photograph of my wife and me at the Grand Canyon that I had kept on the credenza for 11 years, and replaced it with a motivational print about leadership. He was sitting in my chair, across from 2 men in suits who turned when I opened the door. What happened in Nathan's face in that moment is something I have thought about many times since. It was not just surprise. It was the collapse of a structure he had believed was permanent, like a man who's been leaning on a wall for years and suddenly the wall is gone. He grabbed for something and found nothing to grab. I said, "I'll need the room." The 2 men in suits left quickly. People tend to respond to a certain kind of quiet authority. Nathan did not stand up. He stayed in my chair and looked at me across my moved desk in my office, and he said my name, just my name. I sat down in one of the chairs across from him, the chairs that used to be for clients. I let the silence sit for a moment because I had earned the silence. Then I told him what I knew. Not everything. Helen had advised me to say nothing that could complicate the civil proceedings. But enough. I told him about Roy's findings. I told him about the Delaware company. I told him about the filing that had gone to the court that morning. Nathan said a number of things during this conversation. He said it wasn't what it looked like. He said Courtney had told him it was all legal. He said he hadn't known about the fabricated financial records used to have me arrested. And there was something in his voice when he said this that I believed, which was the worst part, because it meant Courtney had used my son as a tool while keeping him ignorant enough to maintain deniability. She had engineered my destruction and let him be the face of it while she operated through a company in his wife's maiden name. I told Nathan that my believing him, even partially, would not change the legal proceedings. I told him that Helen would be contacting his attorney and that cooperation with the investigation would be considered but not guaranteed to affect the outcome. I told him he should leave my office now because I had a company to assess and a great deal of work to do. He stood up. He looked like he had aged 10 years and 20 minutes. He walked to the door and stopped, and he said, "Dad," I said, "leave the key." He put the office key on the desk. He left. I sat in my office alone for a moment. The credenza was bare where my wife's photograph had been. I would put it back. I would put everything back, or build it new, or decide that some things belonged to a chapter that was now closed. I had time to make those decisions. I was out of my cell. I was in my own building. The Delaware company's contracts had been suspended pending investigation. The two redirected accounts had already been contacted by Helen's office and had indicated willingness to restore their relationship with Archer Logistics directly. It was not over. Civil suits take time. Criminal referrals take longer. Courtney had hired a defense attorney who had, according to Helen, begun constructing a narrative in which Nathan was the primary decision-maker and Courtney was a supportive spouse who deferred to her husband. Nathan would need his own attorney and would need to decide very quickly whether cooperation served him better than solidarity. That was his choice to make. I could not make it for him. He was my son, and that was a grief I would carry separately from the legal proceedings, in a private place, and not discuss until I was ready. What I can tell you is that Roy Chin's full audit of the diverted funds, completed over 22 months of painstaking work, documented the transfer of approximately $1.7 million in company revenue through the Delaware company and into accounts connected to Courtney's former business partner from Colorado, the same man who had obtained the restraining order. There was an older structure here, a pattern that predated my son. Nathan had not built this plan. He had been recruited into it by a woman who had been practicing it, or versions of it, for years. Helen presented this to the court. The district attorney's office, after reviewing the referral, opened a criminal investigation. Courtney was served at the house, my son's house, which had been purchased partly using company funds that Roy had traced with considerable effort, on a Thursday afternoon in March. I did not watch. I did not need to watch. I did not need to watch. I was in the Archer Logistics conference room with my operations manager, a 20-year employee named Dale, reviewing the client list and planning a recovery schedule. Dale had stayed. Most of my people had stayed. Some of them had sent cards to my facility, which I had not received until Helen submitted a request for them to be forwarded. There were 31 cards. I read them the week before my release. I read some of them more than once. Mrs. Mild Calloway came by the office that afternoon with a casserole, which is the kind of thing Mrs. Calloway does, and which I have decided is one of the most valuable things a human being can do. I told her I would bring the dish back on Sunday. She told me to keep it as long as I needed. 3 months after my release, the civil case reached a preliminary settlement negotiation. Courtney's attorney made an offer. Helen rejected it without asking me, because it was, in her words, an insult designed to test whether you're tired. I told Helen I was not tired. Helen told them we would see them in court. 6 months after my release, Nathan testified in a deposition that Courtney had presented the plan to him as a legal restructuring strategy, that she had told him the documentation used to charge me had been provided by a third party she had hired, and that he had not known the records were fabricated. He said he had believed his father was genuinely under investigation for something separate. He said he was sorry. He said it several times in the deposition transcript. Helen sent me the transcript. Alan sent me the transcript. I read it once. I put it in the drawer. I am not going to tell you what I feel about my son. That is mine. What I will tell you is that the morning I walked out of that facility in my wife's favorite tie, I made a decision, not about forgiveness. That is a longer road, and I will not pretend to know where I am on it. The decision I made was this. I had spent 4 and 12 days having things taken from me. My freedom, my business, my name, my reputation, my routine, my mornings with coffee before anyone else was awake. They had taken the photograph off the credenza. They had moved my desk. I was going to build everything back, every piece of it. And I was going to do it without bitterness as a primary fuel. Because bitterness corrodes the vessel that holds it, and I had a company to run, and people who depended on me, and a casserole dish to return to Mrs. Calloway by Sunday. I put the photograph back on a credenza. I moved the desk back to its original position. I found nothing motivational about leadership on my walls. I am 67 years old. I have my company. I have my name. The rest is still being decided in courtrooms and depositions and the quiet weight of consequences that take time to fully land. But I walked out of that cell. And I am still standing.